Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into this month's Shutter Mag article. 3 ways to step up your Lightroom Classic for faster editing. So as a Lightroom user, right, we're always complaining, and I say photographers are constantly complaining about Lightroom running slow or how to edit faster or what's wrong with my computer. I mean, you would not believe how many times I hear from photographers, right? Not always tech-based, not necessarily connoisseurs of computing and computers and technology and all those kind of things. So, you're kind of left on your own to either go to the Apple store, go to an electronics store to get a PC. Maybe you build them yourself. Maybe you have all the free time in the world to mess with that stuff. I love to just buy the machine, closed system. If it's broken, I take it back to the place. They give me a new one, right? I go back to the factory. They fix the problems. They deal with it. But I think what's really important is to be thinking about, do you really need a new computer if Lightroom's running slow, right? Think about it from a software perspective. Fix the software, figure out the limitations of that software, and then either your computer is up to speed or not. Having a 6-core processor, 32 gigs of RAM, high-end flash storage, I mean, all these things are great, but where are your expenses better spent, right? So you don't necessarily have to have all that stuff. Of course, it's going to save you time, but in the back end, import, things like that are going to be a little bit faster, but there's certainly ways to use Lightroom to run everything faster. When you're ready to get working, you don't want to have to be waiting, right? So that's the biggest thing here. So beyond hardware, setting up Lightroom for faster results, that's what I'm here to do. So the first way you're able to do that is by tweaking your Lightroom preferences and your catalog settings. Now, I talk about that in a lot of articles, and you might be rolling your eyes like, okay, how much help are preferences and catalog settings really going to affect my day-to-day? Well, it's a lot, right? You update the program, you upgrade your programs all the time, whether you have auto updates or not. Your preferences go back. So it's important to remember, check your damn preferences. That's the first place to start. And a lot of customers find that tweaking those things can really save a lot of headaches. So that's the first one, and really the most overlooked one. The second way that you can speed up Lightroom Classic is importing the right way. Importing matters in terms of, obviously you have to bring your images into Lightroom. What I mean by that is the way you import matters, right? So we'll cover that a little bit further, what that means. And then the third way is playing the previews game. Now, I always mention that in a joking sense, but there are so many people that don't understand that Lightroom's base is previews. Import images, are we building previews? Your images are imported, it's automatically going to build standard previews in the background. Some of these things that you don't notice, like this little square here, it's going to give you preview ready option here. So when you're bringing files into Lightroom, you might see 3 dots here instead of the square. That means that a standard preview hasn't built. Every time you make a damn change in Lightroom, a new standard preview has to be made. There's also one-to-one previews. There's embedded previews. There's smart previews, right? There's 4 different layers of previews in Lightroom. What the hell are they all for? We'll dive into that a little bit further. So let's jump into the most basic but beneficial part of this, dialing in our preferences and catalog settings. All right, so let's jump into the first way to speed up Lightroom. And that's going to be dialing in our preferences and our catalog settings. So to open up preferences, we can hold Command and hit the comma key, and that opens up preferences right away. Typically, you have General selected as your first one, and that's where we want to dive in. So the first thing that I like to do, and these are the default settings typically most users have in Lightroom, especially when you update or upgrade Lightroom, they kind of go back to these defaults. So I like to turn off the Show Splash screen, and what that means is whenever you start Lightroom, it won't have that little Lightroom Classic splash screen. So it just loads Lightroom a little bit faster. You will get a spinning wheel of death. How do you avoid that? Maybe a faster computer. Maybe that helps it. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe Lightroom's just loading a bunch of crap. But whenever you launch Lightroom for the first time, or any time that you launch it, typically makes you wait. You kind of have to, sometimes it's a 10-second process, whatever. I like to turn it off just as a rule of thumb. Now, what's also pretty cool is that you can set your startup catalog. So if you have one that's specific, like maybe your main catalog, it's called Lightroom catalog or master catalog. That's something you can have set up every time you click on Lightroom in your dock, right? So that becomes helpful as well. Another import option is I like to treat JPEGs next to the RAW files separate. So if you have a second shooter that's shooting with the same file names that you are, or you have the same JPEG files in the same folder as your RAWs, this allows you to import both. Now, if you shoot in RAW and JPEG, you probably want to uncheck this. You don't need to bring the JPEGs in. They actually don't help in this situation. You want to be selecting editing on your RAW files, not the JPEGs. So, but you could. I always turn this option on so you have all the JPEGs come in, whether they're the same name files or not. You can check that box. Jumping into the performance tab is where this is typically how most Lightroom classic applications are set up. Graphics processors on auto. What does that mean? Raw cache settings at 5. I mean, there's a multitude of different ways that people have these set up very specifically for what kind of computing power the graphics card is. So unless you've done your due diligence and your research, and you have a graphics processor that's going to benefit from Lightroom Classic, I don't really know of too many unless you're custom building a PC. I haven't found one yet that works well for Apple computers, unless you have the newer Mac Pro. Some of you users out there that have 10 grand to throw into a computer, might be a different conversation, but I, as a default, always turn this off. And the reason why is because I might be working on a 6-year-old laptop, a 7-year-old iMac. It doesn't matter. I turn it off. I run Lightroom without this off, and it runs as fast as I need it to. Running into your camera raw cache settings, I remember reading a few years ago, putting this at 100 makes Lightroom run faster because it saves your raw cache and it just makes it run quicker. I found that actually bogged down my hard drive, which was only 500 gigs, so it's going to fill up 100 plus gigs in raw cache. If you install multiple versions of Lightroom or previous versions of Lightroom, you just have all this like raw cache data stored on your hard drive. It's in the system storage. Doesn't help. So I put this to 5 gigs and I purge it frequently. Coming down here, I always turn on the smart previews. Use these instead of originals. Now, what's funny about this is it's misleading. If you build smart previews and you have your catalog connected to the originals, it doesn't work as fast as if you build smart previews and disconnect from the originals. I'll get to that process and that workflow in just a second. But I find this option just a little amusing. I always check it just out of habit, but it definitely doesn't really help when you have the originals connected. Smart or standard previews have to generate. They generate from the original files. They don't generate from the smart previews. So we'll get to that a little bit later on the processing side. And then I leave generate previews in parallel. It's checked automatically. Leave it alone. Let's jump into catalog settings. Now, what's very important is you have standard preview size, and for this computer, I mean, it's way too large. I do not care about having a standard preview that's that detailed. I'm going to put that to the lowest setting possible, and I'm also going to set this to low. Now, what you'll notice is, if I leave this at auto, just to show you something real quick, we can select all of our images and build previews, and it might run fast because I already have them built, right? But as you see this, how that's running, some of them are built, some of them aren't, but it's running right now on, it's running standard previews on smart previews, right? Because I only have smart previews right now. I don't have the RAWs connected. But just to show you the difference in that is if I go here to update folder location and I reconnect my RAW files, let's jump in here. Oh, got to go to originals, right? Choose. Oh, wrong folder. That's not going to help us. Now we are missing our files. Update folder location. It's going to be in the September folder. And here we go. So now I have my originals and my smart previews. Now, let's go ahead and discard. Standard previews are here, so let's go ahead and build those standard previews and watch that process. Now you're seeing how much slower it is. Look at that. Because I have the originals selected, right? And it's making no difference, right? All we want to do is we want to have our standard previews built. And like I talked about earlier, when those 3 dots are there, it doesn't mean that your standard preview is built. See, right? Now it's built. So it's very important. So as I select all and I'm building standard previews, this is like a little thing that you don't realize, wow, that is running pretty slow, right? So something to fix that right out the gate is to fix your catalog settings. So let's put the catalog settings to 1024 and low, and let's build those previews now with the originals and see the difference. Library, previews, build standard previews, and it did it instantly. I mean, that's pretty crazy. So quite a bit faster, right, as it's building one by one by one. Now, obviously, if I make a change to all these images, I'd have to rebuild standard previews. Think about it. Every time you make a change, it has to regenerate a standard preview. Wouldn't you want that standard preview to run as fast as possible? That's why. Oh, we don't want to do virtual copies. That's not why. Let's undo. I think it stopped in that process. That's why it's important with catalog settings to set these up the right way. Now, the most obvious thing that with Lightroom Classic and previews is you have to think about backing up your catalog, right? You back up your RAWs, you back up your other files, back up software, right? There's all this like security and file management thought process. Maybe you're not backing up files. Maybe you don't have a RAID hard drive. Maybe you only have the raw file stored in 2 places locally, which is just bad, right? There's a 2 local, one off-site for backup. You think about the raw files, but you don't think about your catalogs, right? Your catalogs have all of your edits in there, all your metadata, all your hard work. Obviously, without the RAWs, you're more screwed than without the catalog, but you should be backing up your catalog. How do you do that? Well, in catalog settings, you can choose to have it back up every time. So once I close my catalog, it's going to ask me where I want to save it. So if you're saving it on your local hard drive, which typically is in your pictures folder, I mean, that's just the dumbest thing you can do. Because if your catalog gets corrupt from your hard drive, or you take your computer to the Apple Store or some other computer service, and they wipe your hard drive, whether they say, hey, I hope you're backed up, or you aren't backed up, or whatever the issue is, you lose your catalog. You have no alternate versions. You have no way to access it. So if you use something like Google Drive or Dropbox or cloud storage, you can actually store that to access that catalog from anywhere. Doesn't help if you don't have your original files. Also would need to store your smart previews there as well. But at the very least, you got to back up your catalog. It just makes sense to do. You don't have to do it every time, but back it up to cloud storage. Be smarter than the technology. All right, now that we did our preferences, we can open up Lightroom and you can see the difference without that splash screen and it opening up the catalog immediately into Lightroom. Now I'm still going to get a spinning wheel. We still have to kind of wait for it to process, right? It's the moan and groan of Lightroom Classic, sure. But it shouldn't take 30 seconds. It shouldn't take a while to load. It should be pretty quick. That also might be tied to how many images you have in your catalog and so forth. So let's jump into the second way, and it's importing the right way. Some of these settings might be something you already use. You might learn something here out of the previews process. So real quick, importing files into Lightroom, if you are bringing them in from the memory card, you have to do the copy features. There's copy, it brings up the destination folders. Where do you want your files to go? Likely external storage. I don't have any plugged in right now, but you'd be using I hope, external storage for your raw files to go as the destination source, but then also backing them up somewhere else. I don't like to use the backup feature here. I think it's silly. I like to back up with the folder structure and then use either RAID or some other software to do a mirror of exactly how my folder structure is. Doing it this way is just silly. It's kind of a misleading option here. So jumping into the different options here, right? For any of you out there that are copying as DNG or somebody taught you to do DNGs, you should just say no. DNGs are outdated. They're useless. They require you to work in the Adobe ecosystem. I know some other third-party software accept DNGs, but why would you want Adobe managing your color like at that level? You'd be better off keeping your raw files raw, keeping them proprietary. If you end up using another software, you don't want Adobe solely managing your color. So just wanted to bring that up. But add is what we're typically going to use. Most of us are using the add feature to bring our files into Lightroom. So right, as all of our pictures populate here, they all just kind of show up. Now, what's important is to focus on this file handling panel. There's a lot going on here, as well as the what are we applying during import. So you have build previews. What is that? Well, build previews are going to, after they get added or copied into Lightroom, you can immediately start building previews. And you might think, I better build standard previews. That would make sense. I'll just import, go to lunch, come back, and it's done. That's fine. Standard previews are fine for you to import, but you realize that when it saves your preview files, it's going to save all of that data, and it's going to start to bog down your hard drive. And what I mean by that is if you save larger standard preview size files, it's going to make your previews much larger. Let's jump in here and I'll show you what I mean. Let's jump into Shutter Magazine where these are stored. So let's make this a little bit larger. Okay, so our previews, right? We have smart previews. We're in October. Let's jump into the September. So you can see here's our catalog. Here's the smart previews, 186 megabytes. And you can see the standard previews, right? Just says previews there. So what I'm getting at is if you're building standard previews after import, it's going to build them from the originals, which I like to build them from the smart previews so it's much faster. So what I typically do is do build previews minimum. I want to control this. I want my files to come into Lightroom as fast as possible, and I want smart previews to build automatically. So these are the settings that I choose. Taking this a step further, I can actually save an import preset for culling, one-to-one previews. I can have those copy from my memory card. I can have them go to a very specific folder on the destination drive. I can also make a smart previews preset. So import presets can be saved, and it's going to save whatever settings you have. So if I want to do smart previews, I click on that import preset down there. Obviously, I can save current settings as a new preset if I tweak these to save it for next time. So I highly recommend saving presets. It's the basis of making things faster in Lightroom and the convenience of working with an efficient software. Saving presets, removing human error. Now, the last part of this, as we move off of the build previews, right, there are some options in here embedded in Sidecar that might be selected automatically for you. Adobe put this out to make it faster to cull, so it builds these previews based off the embedded JPEG preview. I think it's a waste of time. I skip right past it. Standard previews we already talked about. Those are going to be building all the time. So I like to build them after I bring them in after smart previews. Now, one-to-one previews are necessary if you are a pixel peeper and you want to be able to zoom into your image. I'll show you the difference between a one-to-one preview on your original file that zoom in at 100% versus a smart preview without the originals connected, zooming in at 100%, just to kind of see that difference, right? If you want a pixel peep at 1:1, 100%, that's necessary. So whenever I'm bringing files in, I'm typically using my smart previews workflow to bring them in more specifically. The last thing is develop settings. There are plenty of people educating saying import with develop settings, don't import with develop settings. Is it an objective thing? My opinion, it's not objective. Don't import with develop settings. You do not want a file coming into Lightroom with a baked on develop setting. And what I mean by that is if you have Lightroom running, let me show you something here. So when you bring your files in to Lightroom, they're raw, and then there's the preview here, the preset being applied. And this is not my favorite preset. I don't know where it came from, but it's just kind of being applied. It's very heavy. It's actually kind of terrible looking. Let's go ahead and reset this. And let's just say, for instance, this was my preset. Just gonna make something up. I don't typically use auto, but clicking on it, let's see what happens. This is what you see. You get a before, you can swap them, right? Before, after. So you can see raw out of camera, flat, not as exciting, preset applied. Cool. Now, when you import with the preset, your before is baked, it bakes on that setting. So you can't actually reset your before. You always see it with that preview. So you actually have to reset your after image and copy those settings over. It's the most annoying thing running between that. So I always import without the develop settings applied. It just doesn't make any sense. So just wanted to bring that up. It's a personal choice, of course, but it's just something I always keep that none, and it makes things run faster because when you have develop settings applied, you have to run it runs a standard preview on both of those, the before and after. So I highly recommend not importing with develop settings. So let's jump into the third step, and that's going to be prepping with previews, or what I like to call the previews game. All right, so now we're ready to move on to step number 3, and for most of you, you're probably interested in what I mean by the previews game. So like many of us, when we bring our files into Lightroom, typically it's at minimal, there's no smart previews being made. You literally have your original files that you are looking at and culling with. Now, when I am culling in Lightroom, I like to remove my panels, so I'll hold Shift and hit the Tab key to make my preview as big as possible. Look at that. See that little load? That was a standard preview. When I zoom in, it's going to do the same thing. So as I go to each image, it's blurry, loads, 1:1. Blurry, loads, 1:1, right? So it's got to do that. It's got to build that 1:1 preview for every single file, right? So I have to wait for that process before I can start calling and doing anything, right? So as I'm zooming in 1:1 and I want to select pictures, see, it takes a second for them to actually be clear. Now it's building some in the background, sure. But as I move quickly through this catalog, it's going to require those 1:1 previews to be built. So in order for me to save myself some time, I like to, see we're waiting, and then it goes. Now it's not too bad, it's not too much time. You have a couple options. So if I want to select all, I could go up here to library and say build my 1:1 previews, and I could go have lunch, go have a break, whatever, and it's going to build those, right? It's going to take the most amount of time to build these 1:1 previews, and you'll notice my previews file is going to slowly get bigger and bigger and bigger as it has to create 1:1 previews. See, as it just jumped up to 130, it's going to create those 1:1 previews, and it's going to be much larger. Now that's pretty minimal, right? We're not talking about gigs of files, but just keep in mind you have tens of thousands of files, you're building 1:1s, it's going to add up, and that's where your storage is going to go. So as it's doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and hit X, and as we keep going through this process, right, as we're zoomed in, I like to do lights out mode. As I'm going through each of these images, it's not loaded, now it's loaded, right? So if you're selecting, you might think that's blurry, but it's not, it's sharp. You just have to wait for it to go, right? So kind of a slow process, but just to show you real quick how slow the one-to-one previews work. And these are working on original files. I also have these original files local, which I know you're not supposed to do that, and I have them on flash storage, so it's running quite a bit faster than what you'd expect on external storage if you're at USB or Thunderbolt or something like that. Now, taking that a step further, what I like to do is when I import my images, like we talked about, is I like to build smart previews. So when I'm building smart previews and I'm running that, let's just say these smart previews are built on these images, and we can run through that process. So we'll build smart previews real quick. Shouldn't take too long to do. And I'm now going to disconnect from my raw files to show you this process. So I'm going to update folder location, trick Lightroom into thinking the files are on the desktop. So that way we can quickly zoom in, right? Zoom in and out. So here's our one-to-one. Now, I built a one-to-one preview. As you can see here, that's the biggest difference. That's as far in as it's going to zoom in. So as I click in and out, it's kind of giving me some errors. So let's quit. Skip this time. Relaunch Lightroom. So that way I can show you when you build smart previews and it builds, you can't really build one-to-one previews with smart previews. So this is our limitation of zooming in. So once we get to our smart preview only, it's only letting us zoom into there. So as we zoom in, next image, see it zooms back out. So you don't get that same one-to-one preview that we were getting on the raw files now. So I'm really messing with Lightroom right now because we disconnected the raws. So this is the zoom you get. This is your 100% view. Can't get in as far as we were able to here. It keeps kind of kicking me out because I'm bugging with Lightroom. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click, we're going to update folder location just to kind of show you the difference between those. You might be thinking, okay, smart previews, one-to-ones, what's the difference? Of course, if you have a fast rig and it's working fine with the originals, keep using it. But like most of us, instead of going out and buying a $10,000 computer system, you can use smart previews to your advantage to make Lightroom run faster. Especially with building your preview files. So let's jump back into connecting these to our originals. Because all these exclamation points are giving me some issues here. Let's make sure. Nope, we're still missing. Let's see here. Shouldn't be. Update folder location. Maybe I need to do, I think it's, you always have to drop down the box, right? So it needs to, it's the fun part of Lightroom. Find missing folder, choose, merge, reconnected. Now we have all of our originals back. So just showing you real quick, now with all these images selected, I'm going to go ahead and discard my smart previews and show you as we're building these standard previews. Standard previews are done, which is great. So those always build in the background. So as we've had the program open, let's go into our selected files and just start going through these. So as we're zooming in, it's got to load those one-to-ones every time. It's still loading here. It's not out of focus. See that? Now it's back in. So those one-to-one previews are going to constantly load. See, it's not loaded here. I can already tell. A little bit sharper. There we go. Same thing there, just loaded. So you're seeing that change, and that's the difference. And when you're calling, you want to work fast. So you might be thinking, well, that's why I use Photo Mechanic, program like that. And I agree with you. Photo Mechanic's going to be faster, But if you run your Lightroom correctly with previews, you build one-to-one previews and you just do that up front, I highly recommend doing that, just so that way when these are done, you can zoom through these files. You also want to keep the standard previews pretty low, so that way when it's generating changes, that's running very fast. Again, there are the proper ways to do things in Lightroom, and then there are the ones that just create more frustration. So hope that gives you an idea on the different previews and things like that that you can build. I highly recommend the smart previews workflow, bringing your pictures in, building smart previews, going minimal, disconnecting your raw files. So that way, once the previews are built, we can then disconnect our raw files, no problems at all. And you can see how fast these smart previews build. So they're pretty quick. They won't take too long for hundreds, even thousands of files. Shouldn't take more than an hour on a full-on wedding. But you can build those smart previews, go take a break, come back, and they'll be done, and you're ready to work faster. And the reason why I say that you can edit faster is working on a smart preview, as we're going through here and making some adjustments, right? Image, next image, next image, next image. Like, right? It's kind of slow. Nonetheless, it's building one-to-one previews, but in my opinion, it's just running slow. So if I want to disconnect this from the originals, go to my desktop, and you'll see it move over to Smart Preview. Let me show you how fast this runs now. Right? So yeah, it might be only a half second faster, but that's enough for me to choose the Smart Preview way, especially on a laptop with 16 gigs of RAM. I mean, this is a 5-year-old laptop, so it's nothing too crazy in terms of computing power, but I can get through this quite a bit faster than if I'm using the original files. And if I want to make edits and changes, right, that's a little much. I can do that quickly to get through these images. So just kind of jumping through that gives you an idea of how to prep with previews. You can always build previews after you import, so it's not do or die at import, but you can discard and build those later. So hopefully that gives you some ideas on how to conquer the previews game, because that's really the core of your Lightroom performance. All right, so here's the results. 3 ways to speed up your Lightroom Classic to edit faster, right? So hopefully you learned something in terms of maybe not in the preferences and catalog settings, since I kind of hammer that almost on every monthly article when it comes to Lightroom, but stepping it up, improving your game, or improving or learning the previews game, I feel like is such a huge component of Lightroom. Really understanding when and how to use previews, understanding the limitation of Lightroom is really going to help you get ahead. So you don't need to go out and buy some $10,000 computing rig or computer, or whatever you want to call it. You just don't need to do it. I mean, you can work, if you're working on an older machine, of course you probably want to have at least 8 gigs of RAM. That's kind of standard nowadays for even laptops. But 8 gigs of RAM is plenty. Having a multi-core processor, 6-core isn't required, but I mean, these days you can definitely get a pretty decently priced computer at that. But when your storage fills up and you go out and buy a new computer and you spend all this money, you really want to be thinking about trying to put as much RAM into it as you can. If you can get a 6-core processor, that would be great. You don't need to put a whole bunch of money into a graphics card unless there's different applications that really need or lend themselves to that. But for Lightroom, for the most part, I would invest more of your time in getting the program dialed in and focus on your storage. So the interface in which your storage device is connected to your computer, whether it's Thunderbolt 3 or USB, those things are going to make a difference. And it's also going to make a difference if you're using mechanical drives versus solid state, or even flash storage. And I don't mean like a jump drive, like a flash drive. I mean like flash storage, which is something completely different. All those different components, if you're working off of raw files on that, I'm working off of my local drive, which isn't recommended, but you can see how much faster it is running on that. If you're using external storage, of course, it's going to slow down, but I definitely recommend Thunderbolt or USB-C for those kind of things. That'll speed things up. So hopefully you learned something. My preferred workflow is the Lightroom Smart Previews and the importing with minimal previews coming into Lightroom. So I always have that set up looking like this. Develop settings turned off. That is my standard for bringing things into Lightroom. And then I'm building previews later. Now you can choose, of course, to build standard previews, one-to-one previews. But as we noticed, if you build smart previews and disconnect your RAWs, you're pretty much losing all of that, all those standard previews and those one-to-one previews, because it didn't build it off the smart previews. It built it off the originals. So I want to make sure that's clear. So when you're importing here, when you're building these previews, it's building them off of the originals. It's not building them off the smart previews. So if you bring your files into Lightroom, build smart previews, you want to build standard previews on these after the fact. You don't want to build them on the originals because it's going to waste your time building them, because it's going to have to rebuild them later. Plus, it's going to take longer. So I highly recommend that, along with the catalog settings. So hope you learned something. Try it out, save some time, and tune in next month.